Hi everybody, I'm Jack Thornling, Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great weekend. We are continuing the library tour of the Great Shelfie Safari, and this week it's a field trip to Oxford. How exciting! The Oxford World Classics are great. It's an imprint that produces many wonderful translations, great scholarship. I don't have quite the devotion to it that I do to another old friend, but there's some great volumes in here. So let's jump in as we dial back 4,000 years to the myths from Mesopotamia. This is a great volume. It has the Epic of Gilgamesh, both the standard version and the Old Babylonian version, translated as all the works are in here by Stephanie Dalley. And it's a good translation. It doesn't have those new tablets. I mean, for crying out loud, there was a director's cut of Gilgamesh. But it also has some other Mesopotamian and Babylonian works, including Descent of Ishtar, some creation myths, and it's interesting. It's interesting to get a slightly larger context, not just Gilgamesh. So this is a recommendation. Then we jump forward a couple of thousand years to Plato and Gorgias, or Gorgias. Gorgias was famously one of the great Greek sophists. And this is one of the rare moments where Plato really presents his great mentor, Socrates, in a true battle with someone who everybody would have known by reputation and name, despite it being set, a generation, 2 generations earlier. And this is one where Socrates continues to do battle with Gorgias, and unlike in the Protagoras, seems to clearly get the better of Gorgias. Gorgias doesn't quite give in, but he certainly withdraws from the debate without conceding, but clearly withdraws and recedes from the debate. And it's an interesting dialogue focused on rhetoric and the idea of, if you're just using rhetoric as a means to an end, as sort of a criminal defense lawyer, and to just profit, is there any value in it? For Socrates and for Plato, the concept of virtue, rhetoric without virtue is meaningless. And Sallust certainly appropriates that with an aphorism, that learning would please me little, which brought its teachers no virtue, no closer to virtue. One I actually have up in my classroom. So this is a very solid translation. It's from Robin Waterfield, who does some other Greek translations for Oxford. And this is one I would recommend. I've mulled doing a where not to start with Plato. I don't know if anybody would be interested in that, but let me know. Then we move forward even more to a guy who's really clearly closer to a student of Gorgias than either Socrates or Plato, and that would be none other than Gaius Julius Caesar, and his take on the Civil War, his rationalizations for all of the great horrors he perpetrated. And this includes also the Alexandrian, African, and Spanish wars, which were completed, ghost-written after Caesar's untimely end. But it's certainly it's a fascinating take on a absolutely critical moment in history. A contemporary of Caesar's and also a student of Gorgias in some ways would be Cicero in The Nature of the Gods. This is not one of my favorite works from him, but I still have my copy. And then on obligations, this is an interesting one. The way in which he actually tries to explore his version of the famous noblesse oblige that Homer describes in the Iliad from Sarpedon. Maybe my favorite, minor character in the Iliad is Sarpedon. And Cicero on obligations is an interesting sort of extension of that within his own context. Again, the context of a man who was willing to cut many compromises. But we move forward to a really, really cool historian, one who I think needs to be read much more frequently than he is, and that would be Diodorus Siculus, or Diodorus of Sicily. And that's because this specifically in his library, books 16 through 20, this is one of our only accounts of both pre-Alexander, so King Philip II of Macedon, but also post-Alexander. So we have Arrian, we have, oh my gosh, it's right in here. There's a Quintus Curtius Rufus Histories of Alexander, but we don't really have a lot for what happens right before and right after, specifically the Wars of Diadochi. And Diodorus is one of our only sources for that. Not a contemporary source, but a classical source. And this is a book I highly, highly recommend. I think that is a really interesting way in which Alexander's empire fragments, and we get the Hellenistic culture with its various forms. It's the syncretism that exists within the different forms of Hellenistic culture that we think of in so many different ways. Moving forward into Roman poetry, we have the great Tibullus. with his elegies. And what's great about the Oxford World Classics is they present on alternate facings Latin and then English translation if you're interested in that. Tibullus is an amazing poet, deeply underrated poet, one I love. I did a video last July on his poems and also those of Sulpicia, and I'll link that video in the description box below. Catullus, I've had this volume for a long time. I read it in college. I read it some years later, I believe after I was married. And Catullus is always ranked as my least favorite of the sort of famous classical Roman poets. And I don't know if it's this translation. It's from Guy Lee. But for whatever reason, I've never been the biggest fan of Catullus. Lucan's Civil War, the Silver Age of Latin poetry and Latin literature, written during the reign of Nero, and a poem that really clearly has Julius Caesar as the bad guy. It also has Pompey as some version of a hero. He was not a hero in real life, but he looked heroic in contrast to Caesar. And the true hero, though, is Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Younger, who pulls like superhero type feats where he goes on this really long journey that would be impossible for any normal human to do. Lucan famously did not finish this poem, the Pharsalia. He was ordered to take his own life as part of a conspiracy against this despicable Nero. This translation is from Susan Braun. It's an excellent translation. This is my favorite version of the Pharsalia. It is a book I recommend reading, but it kind of needs some context and the understanding that it is absolutely totally unfinished. It would have been interesting to see where Lucan would have taken Cato, knowing the end, knowing that Cato will lose to Caesar, but how will he maintain his own sense? And there certainly was already a mythology 100 years later around that. What would Lucan have done there? I think that would be an interesting work. Like if it was finished, how would it compare to a work like the Aeneid or the other epics that we have? So, anyways, the Golden Ass from Apuleius, sometimes also known as the Metamorphoses. This is hysterical, amazing. This translation from P.G. Walsh is very good. It's very readable. I discovered Apuleius from a book in college that talked about Prometheans, Ancient and Modern, by Burton Rasco. And Apuleius was the one who fascinated me the most, along with Petronius. And he did not disappoint. Neither of them disappointed. Moving forward, we have the Poetic Edda. If you've read the Nibelungenlied, if you are familiar with sort of the Old Norse myths, like in versions like Diodorus, Norse Gods and Giants, these are the originals. This translation is from Carolyn Larrington, and it's very readable. It's very good. Very early on, we have just the great sayings of the High One, where we have all of these prophecies around, the what's going to happen to all the gods, culminating in Ragnarok, and it's a fascinating poem. But there are many others. This volume closes, these are the Elder Edda, this volume closes with a bunch of, parallels to the Nibelungenlied, Gudrun, Sigurd, and so many others. Just fantastic. I have a couple from St. Augustine on Christian teaching, which is good. But also the Confessions, and this one by translation from Henry Chadwick. And it's good. One important thing to note with reading Augustine or any of sort of the early Latin church fathers is that if they're quoting from the Psalms, they're using a different numbering from that we find in modern Bibles, modern Hebrew Bibles or modern, full Old and New Testament Bibles. They use a different numbering, and that's critical to note. It can be very confusing to a reader if you're trying to actually look up references in the Psalms, and they seem to be wrong. You're like, what is with these guys? They're using, I believe it's the numbering that was in the Vulgate. So just really want to make that clear. It wasn't clear in this translation for me. I had to discover that after many hours of reading and befuddlement. I also have the major works from Anselm of Canterbury, this famous little ontological argument. But there are other works in here. Anselm was an interesting thinker, a very precursor to the humanism of the Renaissance, I think, in my reading. Moving forward, we dive into the drama. So Oxford World Classics, one thing they do a really great job of is collecting and reprinting a lot of great drama. Not least the York mystery plays. there's not a lot of fans of these out there, but these were plays that are set up around religious festivals, Christian religious festivals, and they show like the life of Jesus, or more specifically the Passion. What's important about the York mystery plays is that there's somebody, and they were all sponsored by different town guilds. It was kind of like a way of, keeping the guild popular and a member of the community. The York mystery plays had, they at one point in some generation found a killer playwright. Probably the best playwright of his era, who adds some interesting context. Like there appear to be motivations. It's not just, sort of straight out of the Gospels, but there's changes. There are characters. There's background and insight, and there's contrast between characters, and almost there's not quite the level of like double plot going on, but or subplot going on, but there's a lot more life to it than what is going on in so many of the other mystery plays. And this volume has those. The York realist, the famous York realist, and specifically their plays set during the Passion. So it's worth paying some attention to if you're at all interested. This is another volume I absolutely love, 4 Revenge Tragedies. So it's Spanish tragedy from Thomas Kyd. Not a great play, but an influence on Hamlet. The Revenger's Tragedy, almost comical in terms of just how absolutely violent and horrifying it is. The Revenge of Bussy d'Amboise. But then the absolutely fantastic The Atheist Tragedy. And an atheist in terms of someone who is not necessarily conforming to the religious expectations. That is one of the best revenge tragedies ever written, including those of Shakespeare. It's one I highly, highly recommend. Cyril Tourneur, I believe, is the author. Yeah. Cyril Tourneur. Revenger's Tragedy is ascribed possibly to Cyril Tourneur, probably to Thomas Middleton. It would fit in with him. And then Revenge of Bussy d'Amboise is George Chapman. The great John Webster, the man who saw the skull beneath the skin. The Duchess of Malfi. Absolutely fantastic, a really strong Jacobean tragedy. The White Devil, one that Virginia Woolf mocks in her notes on an Elizabethan play, but one in which she points out, like, you're not necessarily trying to retell the plot. It's almost incomprehensible, like all the weird betrayals and pseudo seductions that are trying to occur, but there's so much energy to it. Nobody comes away disappointed. But also a pair of other plays, The Devil's Law Case and A Cure for a Cuckold. Neither of those is anywhere near as interesting as The White Devil and The Duchess of Malfi. Duchess of Malfi has a great, great line. Whether by ambition, blood, or lust, like diamonds, we are cut with our own dust. Great line. John Ford, 'Tis Pity She's a Whore, The Lover's Melancholy, The Broken Heart, and Perkin Warbeck, a pretender who pretended to be one of the princes in the tower, and maybe he actually was in real life. I'll let you to figure that out. But the titular play is excellent, truly excellent, great, great play, and one that I might be rereading in September as it aligns to a certain novel I'm currently reading. And then jumping way forward, we have Arthur Schnitzler with Le Ronde, Rondel, the Round Dance, however it's described. Fantastic play. Also a great film by Max O'Fools. But this has Flirtations, The Green Cockatoo, The Last Masks, Countess Mizzy, The Vast Domain, and Professor Bernhardi. The only other one of these I've read is Flirtations. It's not as good as Le Ronde, which is a fantastic play. These are set during roughly like the Belle Epoque, and they certainly show that type of society, a society that we see in works like Proust, or a little bit later than Guy de Maupassant, but just fantastic, fantastic play. And then onward from there into some poetry or drama that's kind of poetry. And this is one of my great favorite translations within the Oxford World Classics, and that would be the David Luke translations of Goethe's Faust, both Part 1 and Part 2. And I've read a couple of different translations of Goethe, and I love the David Luke translations. I really, really enjoy them. I find that there is some sense of poetry and there's movement within the drama. Faust Part 1, I think many people are familiar with. Mephistopheles, or Mephisto, but it's Mephistopheles, Gretchen, and sort of, it really is a tragedy centering on Gretchen in its most humane reading. Faust is quite unpleasant. But Faust Part 2 is a romp. It is wild. It is nothing like Faust Part 1. It is overwhelmed by this concept of eros, that type of love. And it just is suffused with that. And it works in a way that it shouldn't. It is my favorite of Goethe's works. It is really the only one that I actually enjoy from the different ones I've read. I should say, I enjoy Italian Journey. I think that's a very interesting and comical little travel. But Faust Part 2 is very, very just wild and exciting. Christina Rossetti, Poems and Prose, a real great collection of her works. And one of my favorite poets, one of my favorite Victorian poets, along with Robert Browning, and someone who I just enjoy just dipping into, dipping out of. Godwin Market, of course. But there are so many great works in here. Les Fleurs des Mal, The Flowers of Evil by Charles Baudelaire. Again, a great translation. James McGowan in this one. And many, many great poems in here. Also the great Death of Sardanapalus on the cover there. But this is my favorite edition of Les Fleurs des Mal. Arthur Rimbaud, translated by Martin Sorrell. I take it or leave it with Rimbaud. I keep it around because periodically I find something that references Rimbaud, and that allows me to jump in. Along with Paul Verlaine, also translated by Martin Sorrell. And again, it's just sort of there for reference as I'm reading. And then I'll close out with a couple of other works. Walter Pater's The Renaissance, great essay, one that I reread probably about every 5 or 6 years. Joris Karl Huysmans' Against Nature, or A Rebours, very famous as sort of the infamous Yellow Book in Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray. And this is a translation from Margaret Maldon, and this is probably on its way out of the library. This might be one of, on my list of the most overrated books I've ever read. I find very little that is interesting in it at all. But I know a lot of people really love it, and if you love it, that's awesome. Thomas Hardy's Wessex Tales. These are short stories set in Hardy's Wessex. So not the same environment as his novels, the same great landscape, but short stories. And these are interesting. They're a contrast to the deep depth of his, that deep depth, hyperbolic depth. But there is a tendency in Hardy's novels for him to almost get in his own way with overwriting at times and be almost overwrought within that. And that doesn't happen in these short stories. So if you haven't tried Hardy as a novelist, you might try these to get a sense of his writing before spending the time in the novels that really do take their time. Sister Carrie from Theodore Dreiser. I like this more than An American Tragedy. I like it more than An American Tragedy. I'm not a huge fan of Dreiser, but this is my favorite work from Dreiser. And then Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens, a book that many think is a major work. It's certainly a big book. That it merits all the critical attention it's had over the years, I don't know. I highly doubt it. I love Bleak House. I love Pickwick Papers, David Copperfield. Dombey and Son feels like it's not at that level. So those are the Oxford World Classics. Again, I don't have a huge amount of them, but I really do enjoy some of their classics. I love their drama editions, and they have some great poetry translations. So let me know if there are any of these that you are a huge fan of, and we'll continue next weekend. I don't know where we'll go. See you later.